Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you to all for joining us on a Monday morning. I would like to welcome you to this session. My name is Nathalie Stadelman, and I'm part of the Business and Human Rights team at the UN Human Rights Office here in Geneva. I am also a member of the B-Tech team. Lene Wendland, who is our unit chief and the director of the B-Tech project, was very much looking forward to moderating the session, but unfortunately she has fallen sick, so I will be replacing her. I'm glad that we have today with us two distinguished speakers, Jennifer Zirk, who is an independent consultant specializing in legal side of corporate social responsibility. We have been fortunate enough to be working with Jennifer for our accountability and remedy project, and she was a senior consultant throughout the 3 phases of that project, and we are now equally glad that Jennifer has accepted to be a senior consultant for the B-Tech project, particularly on the focus area on accountability and remedy. I'm also glad to welcome Professor Lorna McGregor from the University of Essex. Lorna is the director of the Human Rights, Big Data and Technology project and has very much been engaged as well with the B-Tech project. Let me now just say a few words about the B-Tech project, which we launched last year at RightsCon in Tunis, before then turning to the purpose of the session. The overall aim of the project is very much to embed respect for human rights in business practice related to the development and application of digital technologies. As such, the project is providing authoritative guidance and resources to enhance the quality of the implementation of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. The project has 4 strategic focus areas, namely addressing human rights risks in business model. And if you're interested in the project, you may have seen that we have recently launched a foundational paper on that focus area. The second focus area is human rights due diligence and end use. And there as well, we just recently launched a series of 4 foundational papers addressing this topic. The third focus area is accountability and remedy. That's the focus we are interested in today. And the fourth one is the regulatory and policy response. And the project very much builds on an inclusive and dynamic process of dialogue, consultations such as this one, and research, and upon as well existing initiatives and emerging good practice and expertise. The session purpose of today is to gather feedback on our initial work on a draft foundational paper focusing on understanding the accountability and remedy ecosystem in which the technology companies operate. We had hoped to be able to share in advance the draft paper before the session, but we unfortunately ran out of time. But I understand from the organizer, from ICAR, that the draft paper will be then part of the session resource guide that will be shared afterwards. So we are therefore interested in this session to seek your feedback, which will help us to move our work on that paper, but also on 3 other papers which form part of a series of foundational paper on access to remedy and the tech sector. These 3 other papers, which all focus similarly to this one on the 3rd pillar of the UN guiding principle, are currently under preparation. One will address the fundamentals of accountability and remedy in the context of the tech sector. The second one will focus on company grievance mechanism. And the third one will be looking at the user perspective and of remediation mechanism. So in this session, we will be exploring and focusing on the remedy ecosystem for addressing technology-related harms and how technology companies can make a more positive and proactive contribution to remedy in fulfillment of their responsibility under the guiding principle. I will stop here, mindful of the time we have, and I will now hand over to Jennifer, who will walk us through some of the key points of the draft paper on the remedy ecosystem, and then followed by Lorna, who will offer some reflection, more from a complainant perspective. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie. And thank you for stepping up and taking the role of moderator at such short notice. And hello to everyone who's tuned in this morning. I thought I'd start with just a few words about some of the theory, some of the concepts that we're using in this work, and particularly why we're so interested in the concept of the remedy ecosystem. A really interesting insight from the work that we've been doing over the past few years on the Accountability and Remedy Project is that the effectiveness of what states and companies do in relation to remedy for business-related human rights harms and the impact that they have in practice can vary a great deal depending on the regulatory, structural and cultural environment that they're sitting in. And that's what we call the regulatory, the remedy ecosystem. Now that might sound like a very obvious point, but too often we can get hung up on what a particular mechanism can or can't do in isolation, rather than seeing how it fits in the broader context and the interconnections that might exist between different regimes and actors. So the remedy ecosystem approach that we're using for this work recognizes that there are many points of interconnection between different laws and policies and institutions and mechanisms and actors, all of which that are relevant to remedy. And it really encourages people involved in designing and administering remediation mechanisms to understand and take account of those interactions in the way these mechanisms are designed and operated, rather than approaching mechanisms as kind of isolated units. So in other words, what we're interested in here is what a system overall can deliver for affected people and communities. And that sometimes involves drawing on different processes and working in combination, rather than critiquing individual mechanisms in isolation. So turning to the participants in the regulatory ecosystem, who are the main participants? Well, obviously we're interested in states as the ultimate guarantors and protectors of human rights. Their role is clearly pivotal. Companies, and I'll come back to states in a moment, companies too have a very vital role to play, as the UN Guiding Principles spell out. I'll come back to that point. And of course we don't forget, when we're talking about the remedy ecosystem, we don't forget the contribution of those individuals and organizations who support people and communities who are seeking remedy, such as legal counsel, equality bodies, national human rights institutions, data protection bodies, civil society organizations especially. So turning back to the role of the state in developing and maintaining a sound remedy ecosystem for the tech sector. Now for this audience, I'm going to assume extensive knowledge of the state duty to protect. And I'm going to simply observe that discharging this duty in relation to tech companies can engage many and varied areas of law, which may not have necessarily very obvious links to the business and human rights agenda, which may not be explained or framed in human rights terms. And these can include laws on, well, non-discrimination, freedom of expression, transparency, access to services, competition, privacy, data protection, libel law, fraud, whistleblower protection, as well as the laws that regulate the contexts where technologies are used, such as law enforcement or the media. So the regulatory landscape for tech is already very complex. The relationships between different rights and regimes, however, and how you balance them is not always very clearly expressed in legal systems. So for example, digital and internet companies can encounter, as we know, some particularly difficult dilemmas in balancing rights of freedom of expression, for example, with other rights. So states have a vital role in helping companies to navigate these issues in line with international standards. And beyond regulation and law enforcement. States also have, and various state agencies might support the functioning of remedy ecosystems in other ways, for example, by providing guidance to companies, by supporting affected individuals and communities in the form of advisory centres, strategies to combat various sources of disadvantage, or in some cases by acting as representatives of affected groups in public interest litigation. So as you'll see, and as we've uncovered in the work that we've been doing on the Accountability and Remedy Project, the words that you see in Guiding Principle 28 about states facilitating access to effective company-based mechanisms encompasses a considerable range of activities, which OHCHR unpacks in its most recent report in the Accountability and Remedy Project Phase 3. Turning to the issue of companies and their role, obviously in developing and supporting sound remedy ecosystems, companies too have a vital role to play. And the various contributions that they can make and the various forms that those contributions can take are well described in the UN Guiding Principles. They can involve remedying harms directly themselves and or cooperating with other state processes. But the key point that we would make for here as well is, as with the efforts of state agencies, corporate efforts too need to be appropriately responsive to the remedy ecosystem that they find themselves in which the relevant company operates. And this needs to take account not just of the laws which exist and the manner in which they're enforced, but also issues such as whether there are opportunities for private enforcement. And I just wanted to stress that point in particular, because as we worked through the third phase of the Accountability and Remedy Project, we saw, I would say, too many examples of companies designing and implementing company-based schemes without much regard for the surrounding context, and often relying on quite standardized approaches, with a tendency to approach the design of these things with what some people call a company head-on. So that is from the perspective of what's most convenient, advantageous from the company, without necessarily giving enough attention to how those processes can look and feel from the perspective of people who are seeking to use them. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm going to hand over to Lorna, who has a lot of expertise in that area in particular in the tech sector.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thank you to ICAR for this invitation today. So I just wanted to make a couple of points, just dovetailing with the points that Jennifer has made, but really thinking about these issues from the perspective of a complainant. So as Jennifer has already outlined, ensuring an accessible and effective remedy ecosystem is really critical. We're not looking just at one remedy to resolve everything, but we're looking at how a whole system interacts. But of course, when we think of the design of remedies, a central perspective that we have to bear in mind is, how do complainants understand this ecosystem in order to ensure that it's accessible to them? So when we look at the remedial ecosystem from the perspective of potential complainants, what's really striking is that it can be incredibly difficult to navigate and to follow. And that's particularly because in practice, the ecosystem's often incomplete and it's not seamlessly connected. So we don't have this clear visual at the moment with simple diagrams for complainants on where they have to go for which type of complaint, you know, like some really nice flow chart. And of course, even if we did have that flow chart, we would know that there would be many legal, policy and practical barriers for particular parts of the ecosystem that would mean that you would have to sort of divert and go a different path. And that's the case for state-based remedies within the ecosystem, as well as remedies, you know, within company grievance mechanisms, which may be multiple even within one company, particularly some of the really major big companies that have different grievance mechanisms for different parts of their business. So really, when we're thinking about it from the perspective of a complainant, what we really need states and businesses to think about in the design of that ecosystem is to think about how to ensure complainants don't carry the burden of trying to navigate this ecosystem. And that's both in terms of being really clear on the types of complaints that can be handled by particular bodies and where there's overlaps and choice, which we highlight in the paper. And that can really be a bit of a challenge in the tech sector. As we can see that different state and non-state bodies might offer a remedy or part of one, but they might not treat it as a human rights complaint, as Jennifer has outlined. So you might be finding a remedy in the ecosystem that looks nothing like and doesn't say human rights on it. Or you might find that someone in that ecosystem can deal with part of your complaint, but not all of your complaint. And that might be the case, for example, if we're thinking about the use of algorithms in decision making, a data protection authority might be able to deal with part of it as insofar as it deals with data protection issues, but might not be able to deal with all of the complaint. So we have this, really difficult question as to how complainants will navigate that, and really at the moment them carrying that burden to figure out how to navigate it. So that really speaks to states and businesses being very clear on what each part of the ecosystem does, and thinking about how to triage complaints when they come. Where would you send someone to if you can't deal with it? And that, is a long-standing problem with human rights complaints, but one that's really critical to think about here, because what we don't want is people going around trying to find a home for their complaint and eventually abandoning it because it's so complex in this area. So we want states and businesses to be clear about what they offer within the ecosystem, but there's also an opportunity for states and businesses to work together to really try and get a full picture of what the ecosystem looks like, and critically where the gaps are. As I said in the beginning, it's an incomplete ecosystem. So figuring out where are their gaps and making sure that the meaningful consultation that's highlighted in the UNGPs is really worked through in relation to remedy, to understand what is the experience of complainants and where are the gaps and how can they be filled. And I think the last point I would just make is we do know in this sector, some of the issues are the same as other sectors, but some of the more unique features in relation to the tech sector that have importance for remedies is that it's not always obvious to complainants that they may have been harmed. They might not know that. And so we also have to think about how does the ecosystem connect to the due diligence obligations in the UNGPs. And are there circumstances where states and businesses have to actually proactively inform potential complainants when they come across a potential human rights issue, and to say to them that you may actually have a complaint and you may actually want to exercise your right to an effective remedy. So thinking about how due diligence has a relationship to remedies, I think in this sector is particularly critical. That's all I'll say for now, but thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Lorna and Jennifer, for giving us a good overview of the lay of the land and the key features and the challenges linked to the remedy ecosystem, specifically in that tech sector. Now I will be asking Jennifer to walk us through the key concept and ask questions for the discussion on what does a well-functioning ecosystem for the tech sector look like in practice. And the set of questions under that key point are now being screened. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, and this is where we would love, if possible, some feedback from different members of the audience about your perspectives, because as Natalie said at the outset, this is a very consultative process, and we are, as we explained, on the lookout for feedback about some of the propositions that we're making in order to come up with a really robust set of tools and guidance at the end of this process. We wanted to start with a broad statement of what we think a good well-functioning remedy ecosystem looks like. And you can see it up here on this slide. As you can see, there is a very strong emphasis given to the importance of judicial mechanisms and judicial remedies, which are absolutely at the core. We also, so the first question is around, what are your reflections on this? Does this resonate with you? Is this in your view, a correct characterization of a well-functioning remedy ecosystem? Is there anything that you would like to see added? You'll see that we've asked a particular question about choice, the second question there. And the reason why is that we encountered different views in the course of this last phase of the accountability and remedy project on choice, how important choice is. Most people would take the view that having a choice of mechanisms so that people can tailor their own approach to remedy is extremely important. However, there is a point, there's also a concern expressed that there is a point at which choice can become overwhelming. And of course, even asking the question about choice is based on the assumption that there are, options for remedy in place, which may not be the case. So we asked the question, how important is it in the tech sector in particular to have plenty of choice about how you go about remedying problems? Is there a point at which choice can become overwhelming? And also just to pick up on the question that, on the point that Lorna made earlier about gaps in the system, are there gaps in the way that the remedy ecosystem responds to technology companies and harms associated with technologies, and if that's the case, what are those?
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I wonder if, for time purposes and for letting our audience as well, warm up, if we just should, continue with the presentation of the three other key points and the questions that we are, seeking feedback on, and maybe gather all the questions toward the end. So, Lorna, may I ask you maybe to present us the second point on the role of states in the development of well-functioning remedy ecosystem, and we are now screening as well the set of questions that we are looking for feedback on. Thank you.
Yeah, so just building on the points that Jennifer has just made, really the importance in when we're thinking about states is, avoiding that idea of fragmentation in domestic regulatory responses. And looking at how do we reduce barriers, as I mentioned, legal, policy, and practical barriers that will pose difficulties for complainants, whether individuals or communities, and bearing in mind that in this sphere, we can often be looking at collective complaints. So to try and make sure that complainants are able to access remedies, looking at the question of how states can adopt a more holistic and systems-based to the design and evaluation of the ecosystem. And so the key questions that we're really keen to hear from you on are looking at what are the opportunities for a more efficient, effective, and a sort of a joined up approach. And are they being missed by sort of a siloed or compartmentalization approach in the way that states are designing and looking at these remedies from a human rights perspective? So really the key questions is joining up important? How do we make sure that it's efficient, effective, accessible? And how do we deal with any issues of siloing and compartmentalization? Shall I hand back to you, Jennifer, for the next slide?
Sure.
Yeah. Let's move on, and then hopefully there will be questions once we will have covered all of the slides.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, sure. So unless anyone wants to interject on those issues in particular, I'll move on to the role of technology companies. Now, I introduced this in my opening remarks about the fact that they have a vital role to play, the mechanisms that they create can have a significant bearing on the functioning of the wider remedy ecosystem in practice. We just wanted to have, and that's a general point that's generic to all companies, but we wanted to have a particular sort of deep dive down into how this looks in the technology sector, if people want to share any views on these issues. The first question is, in practice, what kinds of adverse human rights impacts are most commonly addressed by company-based mechanisms in the technology sector? We have our own views on this, but we'd be interested to hear what people's own experiences are. What are, and that's a question about how things are now. The next question concerns looking forward. How can we improve things? What should be the next steps? Should it be to broaden company-based mechanisms, create new ones? Should technology companies be participating more in sector-level initiatives? Is there a need for stronger engagement and perhaps more structured engagement with state agencies and regulators in particular on the kinds of issues that are coming through company-based mechanisms? And also, what are the main advantages and challenges of closer cooperation between technology companies and states with respect to remedy for adverse human rights impacts? In the course of the Accountability and Remedy Project 3, the point was strongly made at times that company-based mechanisms can be a very useful source of information about strategic, structural and regulatory issues. So areas where regulators may be falling down, or where there may be systemic problems that need addressing. So is there a scope for more interaction between companies and states on those specific issues? But are there also risks as well involved in that kind of interaction in certain contexts? So be interested in your views first of all, what should companies be doing next, and also on that engagement point between companies and state agencies to address systemic problems.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Maybe we can just, complete the tour of the key points, and I will be calling upon you again to introduce you to the key reflection around the cross-border challenges.
Sure. Well, it wouldn't be an OHCHR discussion without devoting some time to looking at the cross-border issues. So, as is customary, we're going to spend some time looking at this as well. Now, basically, the first observation I'd make is that technology companies, and particularly those working in communications technologies and social media, are typically very well placed to respond to some of the challenges that we see in ensuring accessibility in cases which have global implications or cross-border implications, what we call the cross-border cases. And the way we see it, company-based grievance mechanisms can, in some cases, be able to respond to cross-border human rights harms perhaps in a more effective and targeted way than domestic regulators and complaints bodies, and particularly those which only have mandates that are very much limited on within territory, on domestic issues, which from our experiences in the second phase of our project would lead us to conclude that that's actually most of them. So the basic point is that company grievance mechanisms arguably have more global reach. Also, there's surely that in many cases there are going to be specific steps that a company-based grievance mechanism can take in quite short order. For example, suspending accounts, which can prevent harm from compounding and grievances from escalating. So in addition to global reach, there might be more options and more flexibility there. So against this background, the observation that we make in the paper is that there is the possibility that states and state agencies may become complacent and begin over-relying on business-led remedial efforts, and especially in difficult to regulate areas is a concern. So what is the best way forward? Here are the questions that we wanted to put. When it comes to responding to cross-border and global human rights impacts, what advantages can company-based grievance mechanisms, what advantages might they enjoy over state-based mechanisms? And I've already suggested a couple that I note. Second question, how do we make the most of these possibilities without, and this is a really crucial point, without neglecting the importance of the state duty to protect human rights, so without losing sight of that crucial role. And also, and here's a more sort of open-ended question, what can state agencies learn from companies in dealing with cross-border issues? And vice versa, what can companies learn from states regarding responding to cross-border harms and challenges?
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I'm very much now hoping that all those key points will have triggered some, questions and feedback from our participants. I see quite a handful of participants online. So I really would like to call on them to just, it doesn't have to address any, specific key questions that we're asking, but maybe just offering as well, their perspective and experience possibly as well with a field which is still very much uncharted. So I think we would really appreciate, even overall, sharing overall insights and reflection on this focus area. Oh, I see. I guess our colleagues from ICAR can give the floor to Isabelle Ebert.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you, Jennifer and Lorna, for this great presentation. I am Isabelle Ebert. I've recently also joined the B-Tech team, but I've been doing research in this area previously in an academic role. And I would be interested to know, under the section of cross-border challenges, if you're also going to explore the role of transparency in sort of state private sector corporations, in particular when it comes to data sharing in emergency situations. So where actually at the moment, the majority of the solutions are found in a sort of closed door interactions between complainants and perhaps the company and the state maybe mediating. But I would be really interested to hear whether you're also going to dive into this area where at the moment there's so much opacity because the key actors are not really reporting and opening the doors about certain emergency practices that they have in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. I don't know if Jennifer wants to start on this one or Lorna.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, and one of the things that we certainly have been looking at in the course of the Accountability and Remedy project, and also and will continue to do so in focused way in this project, is how you get that correct balance between ensuring confidentiality and compliance with data protection standards and respect for privacy on the one hand, with the need to learn from what's coming through these various mechanisms, so that lessons can be shared and understanding can be increased, and that good practice learnings can be shared as well. So there is a significant challenge there, and I expect I don't know whether Lorna's got anything to add to this, but I expect that it would be compounded in the cross-border context, because you have because there are going to be different standards on data protection, privacy, confidentiality, or whether there's more harmonization coming in that field, and I get the sense that there is, and that's a potential solution. But I'll just hand over to Laura in case she wants to add anything.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Isabelle. I think you know, the point that you're making about, you know, transparency in this specific context is critical, but I think it goes wider than that. And I think it's where, you know, there is a real interest in much more reporting and understanding how, well, what level of complaints really are already going through state-based and company-based grievance mechanisms, and different parts of the ecosystem. I mean, I think we just don't have a good appreciation of the nature of complaints coming already. You know, what are ombuds getting? What are companies themselves getting? And then more information around how they're actually being dealt with. And I mean, this is a personal comment, but I've said in a number of meetings before, I think there's quite a lot of lessons to be learned from ombuds and NHRIs that handle complaints around how they can provide information on how they're handling complaints without necessarily identifying complainants, where there are concerns about confidentiality and anonymity, so that we actually have a sense of how these complaints are being developed and dealt with, and how close to international human rights standards and norms the resolution of these types of complaints are. So I think, you know, the particular instance that you're talking about is critical, but I think it's really cutting across the board, and we really need much more reporting and transparency on this to be able to understand how complaints are going in the ecosystem and where the gaps are, and what it's really looking like.
Thank you very much, Lorna and Jennifer, for answering this question. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. I'm not sure if anyone has raised their hands either. No, I don't see anyone. So maybe as we wait for someone to maybe have a burning questions, maybe what I would suggest to do is maybe just to as well, in the spirit of really you know, using this opportunity to engage with ICAR members, to maybe provide more information about the project and how to engage. So as I have noted that at the beginning, we have released a foundational paper on human rights risk in business model. We have as well come out with 4 papers on human rights due diligence and end use. All this information has been sent out to our big contact list as well, and we would like to invite you as well, for those with an interest, to subscribe to our newsletter. You find the link to the newsletter on our web page, on the B-Tech web page at OHCHR. And maybe as well to say that we have few events coming up specifically on this focus area on accountability and remedy. The plan is to have soon the 4 foundational papers. I've noted that there were 3 other that were in the making. We will have a consultation in November, and then we plan to release those 4 foundational paper sometime after that consultation. And we have as well a session coming up at the Internet Governance Forum in November on the state business nexus. And we will be looking as well at the partnerships between states and companies, especially the opportunities, but as well the risks as we have seen them in the response to COVID-19. So that's what will be coming next. We will as well have a session on B-Tech at the UN Human Rights Forum from 16 to 19 of November, which this year is of course taking place online. I don't have yet the date of the session, but the program will soon be out with the details on the global, the UN Human Rights Business and Human Rights Forum web page. What else? Maybe just to invite all of you as well. And again, we're sorry that we were not able to share the draft paper in advance, but just to invite all of you to stay engaged with us as we continue working on that focus area, but as well on the other focus area of the project, so that you can contribute to our thinking, on our understanding as it evolves. We very much as well believe that any output and guidance from this project should really reflect the broad range of perspectives and voices. So we are very much looking as well to engage with diverse voice and be sure to have geographic perspective in our work. And I think that ICAR is a great avenue to make sure that we can, involve a more diverse voice. And yes, so I would say that if there are no other questions, I just would like to really invite you to consult our webpage, which is now that you have now on the slide, and to write to us with any thought, any questions, anything about the B-Tech project, and we will gladly respond to you. Maybe I could just give the floor if she's ready, because I didn't consult her on that, but maybe Isabelle, if you would like to say a few words about the session at the Internet Governance Forum on the State Business Nexus.
Yeah, thank you, Nathalie.
Sorry to be calling you like that.
So the focus will really be to see what sort of lessons learned and sort of best practices are emerging from the response that technology companies and states and civil society have found across the globe to deal with sort of the issues around COVID-19 in this tech space. So we would like to touch upon the tension between data protection and privacy with regard to the contact tracing, tracking, and all these different solutions that have come up. And by exploring the different solutions that states and technology companies have sort of found in order to govern the pandemic, we want to see if we can identify ways in which going forward there could be better practice, if unfortunately not, but if ever we were in a similar crisis situation again. So that will be the major sort of focus. Other than that, we will of course also touch upon a little bit some of the work that we have been doing in the foundational papers. But I think it would be a great opportunity for everyone to really reflect upon some of the evidence we have seen in response to COVID-19 and how tech can be, on the one hand, really a force for good, but on the other hand, it has also become more than abundantly clear that the sort of management practices that technology companies and states have been engaging in could be in some areas still improved. So yeah, we'd be really happy to see you then. The panel is in the beginning of November. An early draft of the session is already up on the IGF homepage. And yeah, if you have any questions on the panel session, you can always email us, and also with regard to any other content you might want to discuss with us.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, for this appetizer for our upcoming IGF session. I see now a question in the chat box from Henry Peck from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Thank you very much, Henry, for your question. So I will read it to both Jennifer and Lorna. So the question reads, on the work of states in the development of a well-functioning remedy ecosystem, could you say a little more about what a more holistic and system-based approach might mean?
I can start if you like. Yep. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, thanks Henry for your question. And it's an area, it's a really good question, and it's one that we've devoted an enormous amount of work to actually in in the course of the Accountability and Remedy project, and we'll continue to develop that in the B-Tech project. But basically, it's about recognizing that there are interconnections between different regimes that are not immediately obvious, and it's about capitalizing on those. And there's, if you have a look at the two reports, the most recent reports that have been put together in the Accountability and Remedy project, you'll see a kind of a list of issues that states can be looking at in order to try and make systems better connected. And so that there is more flexibility for people, so that there's an easier, and this goes back to what Lorna was saying, there's a much easier pathway, a readily identifiable pathway through. It basically recognizes that, as I said, those interconnections, states should be looking at ways to smooth the path for referrals between different kinds of remedy mechanisms in a rights respecting way. It's really putting people in the driving seat so that they have a lot more flexibility and the ability to pick and choose between mechanisms, and also so that they don't get locked into a particular route. And it's basically just to make the system a lot more dynamic. But if I commend to you the two reports for Accountability and Remedy project phases 2 and 3, which kind of goes into it in a great deal of detail in the first parts of that guidance, and it really it sets out a number of steps and things that states really need to be looking at when they review the sort of totality of mechanisms that might be available for a specific sector, or to address a specific problem.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I don't know if Lorna, you want to come in?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I always just start thinking about these things from the perspective of someone that would have a complaint, and thinking about, different scenarios you can think about in the tech sector about what types of complaints might you have. And then how would you even start figuring out where to go? And are state institutions that you might think about, depending on where you live, or are they obvious to you where you would start? And can you go yourself directly and handle it yourself, or will you need support? Is it obvious how you might go to try and get some legal aid, or is some advice, from an ombuds or from an NHRI or a quality body or data protection body? So where, what are all the different institutions available that are offered by the state that would be able to help you navigating that role, and to try and be able to think what they are, and as Jennifer said, and then what is the relationship between them? So you might get advice from someone, but they can't actually take your complaint, but then they can help you get to another institution. But really, it's so important thinking about how to avoid a person just trying to be sitting researching for hours because they have a complaint. They maybe don't know what that complaint means in legal terms. I mean, that's the other really important thing that we have to think about here, that people describe complaints in their own words, and they need to be able to find an institution or a way to get that complaint started without having to say, employ legal analysis to say, oh, this is a data protection issue, or this is a privacy issue, or this is discrimination. So it's about really just trying to map out what that looks like. And I've been involved in different research in the past trying to look at what that type of system looks like, and it just varies between states massively. Some states have so many different types of institutions that it's really hard to try and figure out how to do that, and others have less. So it is a state-by-state process of trying to figure out what it looks like, but it can be quite bitty. And I think that's the point of looking at what the system-based thing looks like, is how does it all interact and work as one, rather than little bits here and there.
Thank you very much, both Jennifer and Lorna, for this very good answer to this question on on what a more holistic and system-based approach might mean. We are close to the end of the session. I just wanted to flag as well, as I have introduced very briefly the 4 focus area of the B-Tech project, I wanted as well to mention that we will be looking at and across all those 4 focus areas at both the role and the responsibility of investors. And we are very fortunate to have now in the team as well, who just joined recently as well, Paloma Munoz-Quick, and I'm sure many of you know her well, and I see that she is as well online. So I just wanted to flag that as well, that it's a very welcome addition to the B-Tech team, and as well this specific mainstream somehow that we will have in the project, looking at the role and responsibility of this very important stakeholder. So I think with that, if there are no other questions, I will thank you all very much for your time, and again invite you to be in touch with us, especially once you will have as well seen the paper that will be part of the documents of the ICAR conference. With that, I will hand over to Melissa for closing the session. Thank you very much.